first of all, welcome to my spare bedroom, where I know we're all doing this, right? We're all in our random rooms or whatever. So spare bedroom here / makeshift office where you can see an elephant accidentally strategically placed behind my camera right there. So thank you, everybody. It's very unfortunate not to be able to see all your lovely faces, but we will try to make this as interesting and exciting as I possibly can. First of all, that was an excellent intro. Thank you very much. I work on Symfony documentation team. My main job is symphonycast.com. And of course, most importantly, if you've seen my presentations before, this is the most important slide of my presentation. I am the husband of the much more talented Leanna Pelham, who was no doubt next to me in that Paris bar somewhere dancing harder than I was. And now I have, of course, a second thing here. You're my captive audience. So I now have a 3-year-old son, so also father to my much more charming son, Beckett, who is with his grandma and grandpa this week. So this is like crazy single Ryan week where I get to do whatever I want all week long because I get a temporary break from being dad. And of course, what do? I hang out with you guys. This is basically what I like to do. All right, so today we are talking about Webpack Encore plus the rest of modern JavaScript. I gave that title and sort of thought I'll figure out what to talk about when I make the presentation because things are constantly changing and there's lots of interesting things to say. Now, if you've seen a presentation from me about Webpack Encore before, some of this might be things you've seen before, but not everything is going to be the same because there's going to be several new things that I want to show you about kind of the JavaScript ecosystem. So, of course, this is the official name of the talk, but in reality, we are going to talk about all of modern JavaScript in 45 minutes, which includes things like ES6, ES2015, ECMAScript, Node.js, Yarn, Babel, Webpack, React, Vue, modules, and we could have kept going with like 3 other lines of things. And of course, the 12 new things that they invent during this presentation. So, oh, by the way, if you want to follow along with the actual code that we're going to do, you can grab that bit.ly/UK-symphony-code. That will take you to a GitHub repository with the final code from this presentation. The history of that, because we are all Git nerds, if you want to look at the history, you'll see a clean commit by commit history of that, so you can actually step through and see what's going on. All right, so let's start with our very high-tech important application here. We are, of course, creating a store for sheep. So here's our array of products. And in our page, we're going to have something like this. So I have a button and I have a div with ID equals app. So trying to keep it very, very boring and basic. And I have a script tag pointing to my app.js file. Okay. And then I'm going to write just a little bit of JavaScript to make our awesome application run. And notice I'm not using jQuery or any other libraries here. And I'm doing that in part because I've been around for JavaScript for a long, long time. So I used jQuery for a really long time, and we still use it in lots of different places. And more recently, I've actually been playing with basically just normal raw JavaScript. And it turns out you can basically do everything you want to with normal raw JavaScript these days. So I've kept my JavaScript examples purposely using normal low-level JavaScript. In case you haven't seen or can't remember what it looks like, you'll get an opportunity to see what it looks like to write some JavaScript without any help. And it's actually not very difficult. You can use the document.query selector to find elements and then button.add event listener. So when we click that button, we're going to fill in our app element with the list of products. So here's our very high-tech application, and drum roll, when we click the button, boom. This is the thing that we're working on. So another look at that code, very, very basic code here. Now, if you have been coding more modern JavaScript within the past few years, then your code might not look like this. It might look a little bit more like this. And if you are not sure what you're looking at, that was definitely me a few years ago, what we're looking at here is actually totally JavaScript, even though it looks very, very different than my other code. And even though it looks very, very different than anything you would have seen 5 years ago. So some terminology here to help you navigate the landscape of JavaScript. ECMAScript is actually the official name of JavaScript. So the tricky thing is that with PHP, there's a single central repository which holds the PHP source code. So if you want to add a feature to PHP, you make a pull request to the source code, and then you get the feature. It's how almost every language on the planet works. But there's not one JavaScript. There is Node.js. That's a JavaScript engine. There is the Chrome JavaScript engine. There is Internet Explorer's JavaScript engine, whatever that is. And so you can't just add a feature to JavaScript because there isn't one JavaScript. So instead, there is this thing called ECMAScript. And if you want to get a feature added to JavaScript, you actually write a big, giant, boring document that describes the feature, and you submit it to ECMAScript. And then there's a long process of getting your description of the feature accepted. If it is, then all of the JavaScript engines, Node, Chrome, then they actually build the feature into their system. So ES6, also known as ES 2015, also known as Harmony, called by its friends Mod, that is the 6th accepted, so official version of ECMAScript. And at this point, there is a new version of ECMAScript every year. So there's ES 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and all of those add new features to JavaScript. However, ES 2015 was the big one. This added a huge number of features. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about just ES 2015 or ES6 to be synonymous, to mean sort of new JavaScript, even though some of the features may have come in later versions. Most of them came from this version. So going back to our old code here, we're going to give you the, in case you aren't too familiar, I'll give you the 2-minute intro to everything you need to know about ES 2015. So here's our boring code. The first change you can make is you can change var to const. And I'm not even going to go into the details about what the difference is, but basically var and const are almost the same, except for const is more hipster. So you're going to see const and its cousin let being used these days instead of var. The other thing, probably maybe my second favorite feature of ES 2015 is a traditional class and inheritance syntax. This is especially good for us as PHP developers because this class syntax looks like PHP's class syntax. We can look at that and it makes sense to us. Historically, JavaScript has a prototypical inheritance system, which is just very, very foreign to PHP developers. It looks very, very strange. Now, in reality, JavaScript still has prototypical inheritance and prototypical object structure, but they kind of put the easy button on top. So behind the scenes, it's still the same old JavaScript, but we now get to work with classes and methods and constructors and very easy things like this. Now I'm going to make one small change to our application here, and that is that I'm actually going to, I'll actually show you the code. And I'm just going to do a little refactoring. It's not very important. I'm actually going to pass the DOM element to my store here. So I'm passing an array of products. I'm passing the DOM element. And then inside of here is where I am adding the event listener. And then on click, we're going to set the inner HTML to our product string. Perfect. Nice, meaningless little refactoring. And then to instantiate this, we're going to say store equals new store, passing at that app element, and then our array of products. But surprise, that's not going to work. So in this case, we're going to get this .product string is not a function because classic JavaScript problem, inside of our callback here, this variable is not our object anymore. So we see this whenever we add event listeners or whenever you have a callback from an AJAX call. As soon as you're in that callback, this becomes some weird foreign thing, something different, not what you expected. It's not the store object that you expected it to be. So probably the last massively important feature of ES 2015 is the arrow function, which you've probably seen at this point. It's just that simple. The word function goes away. You add this little equal arrow, and that's a callback function. But the reason that it exists is not because it looks more hipster, which it does, so people like using it, but it fixes the this problem. So now inside of our callback, this is going to be what we expect. This is going to be an instance of our store object. So arrow functions, you see those everywhere because it's almost always how you wanted your callback to work. So basically they're used almost everywhere now instead of the traditional function syntax. And that's basically all I want to say about ES 2015. There are lots of other features I haven't mentioned. Those are the three I did. There's also a thing called a spread operator. There's something called object destructuring. There are template literals, which are pretty cool, where you can actually put little dynamic expressions in the middle of your string instead of doing the closing quote plus open quote type of thing. But for the most part, you'll see lots of tutorials and things about like, let's learn ES 2015 or let's learn all the features of modern JavaScript. And unless you just like memorizing things like an encyclopedia, you don't need to do that. You're just going to see the features and discover them along the way. These first three here are probably the most important so you can actually understand what's going on. But the big question is, does it run in a browser? Because this is new stuff, right? I mean, some of these features are now 5 years old, but still, no one upgrades their browser. So will it run in a browser? The answer is maybe. Depends on what browsers and what your users of your site are using. So now we just need to wait 5 years for the worst browsers to support this. Except, don't worry, we don't actually need to do that. That would be a really, really, what if I just ended the talk right there? It's like, sorry, well, we'll revisit this in 5 years. There is going to be a way around this, and we will talk about it later. So we are going to be able to use these new features, even if our users are using old browsers. So the one big feature in ES 2015 that I haven't talked about yet is something called JavaScript Modules. So the classic problem is that if you want to take a big chunk of JavaScript and split it into multiple files, because you want to organize them in a little better way. Same thing we do in PHP and Symfony, right? We take big chunks of code, we put them into their own classes. It helps us unit test. It helps us keep our sanity. But historically, if you wanted to do that in JavaScript, then you would need to remember to include both script tags on the page. And they would have to be in the correct order. If you put them in the wrong order, then things would break. Or if you were using a build system like Gulp or something, you probably would have an array of JavaScript files, but it would be the same thing. You'd have to have them in the right order. You'd have to remember to include the new one. It's crazy. Like, that's just not how programming works in anything else we do. That's a very, very fragile system. So that's the problem that modules aim to solve. And it looks like this. The idea is that we're going to take our store class that we were working on and actually isolate it into its own file. So now we're in a store.js. And what's going to happen is we're actually going to use this export default syntax that's actually going to export a value from this file. So you can export a class, you can export a function, you can export a string, but the idea is that a JavaScript will export a value. Okay, so this is exporting a class. Then, sorry about that. I just realized one of my slides disappeared. Where did that slide go? Well, we're gonna do some cowboy coding here then, because I actually want you guys to see the next spot. So if store.js looks like this, then our app.js, where we actually want to use that class, is going to look like this: import store. This is my first time coding inside of directly inside of Keynote. This is very exciting. There we go. And then we'd have something like const store equals new store, which you love it when your editor capitalizes things for you. Oh, all right, so that's not the, it would be nice to see the rest of the code. The idea is that here's what our code looks like. We're exporting default class from store.js. And when we want to use it, we're going to import store from, and then, forgot one thing. There we go. From /store. So the import is the syntax for importing is import, and this is going to be the new name of the variable, and this is going to be the file that we're importing from. So since this exports a class, store is going to be that store class. And you don't have to have the .js. You can put the .js on if you want, but JavaScript doesn't force you to. So that's why you never see the .js on there. It's implied. So you want to have that in your mind. Oh yeah, the one other thing I was going to say about this is, so it kind of works a lot like PHP require statements. You know, we're sort of requiring the file here. The biggest difference is that in JavaScript, they have this idea that a file will export a value. Whereas in PHP, when we require something, we just get whatever is inside. So if I require a file and it has 5 classes and 3 functions, then boom, as soon as I require those are in scope, they exist. But in JavaScript, that's not the case. We're just going to get what value is exported from that. So this is awesome. I'm like, this is the game changer here. This is, in my opinion, JavaScript's #1 problem. The fact that I have to keep all of my code in a gigantic file or try to split, but then it's a total headache to keep everything in the correct order. So if we can solve this problem, we can actually start writing professional JavaScript. Unfortunately, when we try it in a browser, we get something that looks like this. Cannot use import statement outside a module. And the short story is that module loading in a browser is hard to do. It's possible, but it's like kind of barely possible, and it's not a very robust system. And it sort of makes sense. I mean, if you see, if I go back a little bit, if you think about how this would work in a browser, the fact that a browser is asynchronous, the fact that you have to make network calls to get JavaScript files, the way that it would kind of maybe work is JavaScript would your browser would download this file, it would start executing it. As soon as it hit this import line, it would wait while it goes and downloads that. And then if there was another import statement, it would wait again. It would freeze our code and wait and go download that. So it is possible to get this working in a browser, but it just doesn't work all that well. It's difficult to get working because browsers have to asynchronously get resources. And so that's a difficult thing for it to do and stay performant. So this is where, and I kind of do that setup here because I'm sure you've heard of this next tool, but I want you to understand what its purpose in your life is. This is where Webpack comes in. So Webpack is known as a module loader, and it's going to solve this problem for us. So part of this presentation is, of course, about Webpack Encore, which we are going to talk about in a second. But before we do, I want you to actually see what it would look like to use Webpack by itself. Not because you necessarily will, but because this is going to really help understand what it actually does. So the first thing we're going to do is actually install it in our project. Now, I didn't talk about Yarn yet. You may already be familiar, but Yarn is the composer for Node. There's also NPM and Yarn. There's 2 of them. You can pick your favorite or pick one out of a hat, but you'll either be using Yarn or NPM. And so we do yarn add Webpack and Webpack-CLI. And that's just going to download everything into a Node modules directory. So Composer downloads things into a vendor directory. This downloads things into a Node modules directory. But other than that, it works very, very similar to Composer. Now, a reminder, this is the setup. Here's the code I was looking for earlier. We're exporting a class from store.js, and we're importing it from app.js. So if you think about it, the app.js file here is really our entry point. This is really the file that we want to point our browser at. And then this is what we want to execute. And then we want something else to worry about, kind of making sure that the store.js is available so that this code runs. This is the code that we want to run. So what we're going to do with Webpack is we're going to run yarn run Webpack, and we're going to point it at that file that we want to execute. So our public/app.js, that's kind of our entry file that we want to execute. Then we give it a -o for output, and we tell it to output a file, output a new public build app.js file. Now, when we do that, that is going to write an app.js file. And the critical thing is that app.js file is going to contain the source code from both app.js and from store.js. So Webpack's main job, and it can do other things, but its main job is it looks at this app.js file, finds every import, follows that, grabs that source code, follows any more imports if it needs to, grabs that source code, and finally puts them together into a big final package that contains everything that you want. So this is huge because this actually fixes that problem. This means we can separate things into multiple files. All we need to do is basically code correctly. If we are using that import statement and the export statement, if we're writing our code correctly, then Webpack's going to take care of creating a final package that actually puts all those things together. Now, in reality, you're not going to see Webpack run with those command line flags. You're going to see it a webpack.config.js file. So you'll see that all over the internet. But it's just this simple config here is saying the same thing that our command line did a second ago. So it's saying basically, I want you to read the app.js file and follow its imports. And then once you get all that code, I want you to output it into a public/build directory. So public build app.js. So this just means we can run yarn run Webpack, and we don't need those flags because it will read it from the config file. So great. Now let's just add more features to Webpack. So there's lots of features we can add, like file name versioning, where the output file has a hash in it that's equal to kind of an MD5 of the contents, and it automatically changes whenever you update your files. React, Vue, Post CSS, Sass. There's lots and lots of extra features that you can add to Webpack. And if you do, it's quite easy. Your final code just looks something like this. Might zoom in to see that a little bit. So this is from a real project, a few years old now, and this is actually what our webpack.config.js file looked like shortly before I created Encore, because I was like, this is insanity. So this is a fully featured Webpack setup, but like this is crazy. And there's lots of complexities, like you want to enable source maps, but you only want to enable source maps on the development environment, but not production environment. You want to minify, but only in production, but not development. So there's lots of conditional logic in here. It's very, very difficult to get this working correctly. So this is where Webpack Encore comes in, and it's a very, very underwhelming, boring, overrated tool that I love. It's just a glorified Webpack config generator. So first, we're going to start over. So we're going to delete everything. Package.json is the composer.json for Node. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to delete its lock file. I'm going to delete all my vendor stuff. Completely start over, because we're not going to use Webpack directly. Instead, we're going to composer require Encore. So I assume that many or most of you are Symfony users, so you'll recognize that as a flex alias. This actually downloads a small Webpack Encore bundle, and we'll talk about what that bundle does in a second. And its recipe comes with a couple of things. It comes with a package.json that already has a few lines in it for things like the Webpack Encore library, a webpack.config.js file that we'll see in a second, and a couple of config files. So this is giving you a small bundle, and then it's kind of giving you the two files that you need to get started. And then in that webpack.config.js file, this is basically what it looks like. It's just configuring the exact same stuff you had before. So as I mentioned, Encore is nothing more than a Webpack config generator. It's still Webpack behind the scenes. So you're able to require this Encore object, and it just has really nice methods on it for configuring everything you want, like the output path or the entry file, like we talked about earlier. So add entry, and you say, okay, I want you to go read public/app.js. And the end result of this is it's going to build a public build app.js file. Now this first argument here is not really important. If you change that to a robot, it would just mean that this would output a public/build/robot.js file. So first argument here basically just ends up being the file name in the public/build directory. And then there's one example here of what it looks like to kind of enable some of those features. But the really important thing I want you to see, and I'm really proud of this, is it's just generating standard Webpack config. So it's not trying to use Webpack in some weird way. It's really trying to be as small of a layer around Webpack as possible, so that you're truly using Webpack. And if you need to, you can add things to the config. You could take this config down here. People do this all the time. and then actually change something or add some extra configuration before they finally send it back to Webpack. So now to run this file, we're gonna execute Webpack a little bit differently. There's an Encore executable, but basically we say yarn encore dev. There's also a production mode, which minifies your files and does some other things. And then I'll do -- watch, so it watches for changes. And then to get this to run, now remember, the whole point of this is that it's ultimately going to build a public/build/app.js file. So it would mean that in your page, you would think, okay, I'm going to add a script tag that points to public/app.js. I need to point it at the built app.js file because it contains all of the files from all the imports put together. But in reality, that one small thing that bundle gives you, the Webpack Encore bundle, it gives you a couple of twig functions. So instead of adding that script tag by hand, instead we're going to call Encore entry script tags app. And this is the name of the entry file, and it's going to add the script tag for us. So you might be thinking, why do we need that? Excellent question. So really behind the scenes, there's something in Webpack, and it's automatically enabled with Encore called code splitting, and it's awesome. So in reality, when we, in this example, when we call that twig function, it doesn't output a single script tag, it outputs 3 script tags. And that's because Webpack looked at our code and actually decided that the most efficient way to output this would actually be 3 files instead of 1. Now, we've been told for years that, what we want is less network requests. So we don't want 3 JavaScript files, we want 1 JavaScript file. And that is true. There's some truth to that, but there's also a trade-off between like code being shared on other pages and a couple of other things. So what's happening here in this case is that when our application runs, Webpack automatically notices that some of the code in that final file is written by us, but some of it is actually coming from the node modules directory, where we're using some third-party libraries. And so Webpack automatically splits that stuff from the third-party code. It automatically splits it into a different file. That's what this vendors _app.js thing is here. That's going to only contain code from the node modules directory. Now, why does it do that? The idea, and of course, you can always configure this stuff however you want, but the idea is that code that comes from the node modules directory is more likely, actually, let me say that different. Code that comes from the node modules directory is less likely to change. So think about how your browser, if a user comes to your site, how their browser caches these things. So they make a request to the site and it downloads those 3 JavaScript files. Then they go to the next page and they don't need to download those 3 files because they're in the user's browser cache. Now, let's say we make some small change to our application, we deploy. Now the app.js file is going to be changed, which means that the user's browser is now going to download that. But they're not going to have to download this vendors _app.js that contains the node module stuff because that didn't change. So the idea of splitting these things up is that you can isolate the code, oftentimes the bigger code, the vendor code that doesn't change very often, from the smaller code that is going to change more often. And there's more to this. If you start having multiple entries, which we'll talk about later, then Webpack is going to start splitting these files into even more files so that different pages are able to share code without making the user download them multiple times. But at the same time, Webpack also realizes that at some point you don't want to have 10 script tags that would not be performant. So it's balancing splitting into files versus splitting and having things more reusable and better cached versus having too many files and that taking too long to download. So Webpack comes with a really nice algorithm for figuring that out. The nice thing is we don't really even need to think about this except for listening to my explanation one time, because we just use this twig function here, let Webpack figure out how it wants to split those files up, and we're done. So inside of Encore, there are lots and lots of features. We talked about what it looked like to add those to Webpack earlier. In Encore, they're just a bunch of methods that you can call in that object to turn those on. And of course, we are all, like Tobias, whose new library is awesome, we're all about customer service. So if, for example, you suddenly try to, well, actually, I realized that this will make more sense in a second, but in a second, we're going to see how we can actually process CSS through this same pipeline. But if we suddenly wanted to use Sass, and so we tried to reference a file called styles.scss, as soon as we do that, Encore is going to give you a super helpful error. It's going to say, hey, that's cool that you want to use Sass, but you need to enable it in your webpack.config.js file. And also, you're going to need to download the libraries that enable that. So Encore sort of starts small, but then as you use more features, it says, oh, you want to use React? Great. Make sure you install these libraries so that we can do the React stuff. And the last thing I just want to point out is that when you use that Encore recipe that gives you that package.json file, it comes with a scripts section, which defines some shortcuts that you can use. So yarn watch is what you can use inside of a project because there's a watch key inside of your scripts. So that's a really common thing. If you ever see somebody talking about like yarn donut, and you're like, what is the yarn donut command? Check the package.json file because there's a good chance that the donut command is defined under this scripts thing. So it's a nice shortcut, and as long as you know what's going on. So what about that browser support problem with all those new arrow functions? Well, that is where another tool called Babel comes in. And this is another tool that you will very likely never need to really even think about, but it's a really important part of your pipeline. So it is a JavaScript transpiler. How's that? Word of the day is transpile. To read source code and output different source code. That is transpiling, which I learned when I started learning about Babel. So Babel is going to read source code and then output different source code. So a really good example is that Babel has the ability to read TypeScript and then output normal JavaScript. So it can go from TypeScript to JavaScript. It can transpile coffee to tea, British beer to American beer, which is what I like to do. And also, most importantly, ES 2015 JavaScript to ES5 JavaScript. So it actually has the ability to read the new hipster JavaScript, but then transform it, rewrite it into old, boring JavaScript. That is the key thing that's going to allow us to write new code, but then have it work in all of our browsers, because it's not actually the new code that our browsers are going to be executing. So using Babel, step one, you're done. You're already using it. Thanks, Encore. So that's one of the key features that's built into Encore. You need Babel in almost every project. There's not even a way to disable it, I don't think. We've had a couple requests for that, but almost all cases you need Babel. So it's just built in. So I don't have an example inside of here, but you could actually look at your build file and you would see, for example, that your arrow functions are rewritten to normal functions. And then they do some extra magic to make sure that this variable is the correct thing. So when we run yarn watch or yarn dev or whatever, it means that the public build app.js file is going to contain the contents of the original app.js that we pointed it at, plus all the files it imports, and the code is rewritten to work in old browsers, which is awesome. So we don't need to worry about the imports. We don't need to worry about the new syntaxes. It's all going to be handled for us. Now, one of the cool features about Babel is that you can actually configure the exact browsers that you need to support. Because when it rewrites the new code to the old code, it does make your final code a little bit bigger, a little bit more verbose. So if you can target just the browsers that you need to support, then it can actually rewrite less of the code in some cases. So browsers list is the library that helps you do that. So you can actually go into your package.json file, add this browser list key, and then it has this really powerful syntax for specifying the exact browsers that you need to support. So in this case, I'm actually being very aggressive. This means I only need to support browsers that are used by more than 1% of the population. So browsers list actually uses current true browser usage information to figure out what features it needs to support. So this would go get a list of all of the browsers that are used by more than 1% of the world. It would then look at all of the features that those browsers support, and it would determine which code it needs to rewrite and which code it doesn't need to rewrite. So with this aggressive configuration, which includes saying I don't need support for IE11, this would actually cause my, my source code to basically match my built code. It wouldn't need to rewrite anything in the code that we've written. One last thing I want to mention about this, because I want you guys to be sort of production ready, is the concept of polyfills. So Babel's job is to rewrite syntax, new syntax changes like the class syntax or the arrow syntax or the const syntax. So Babel does a great job rewriting syntax. However, that is different than just new features, like a new function on array. There's a new function on array called find, or the promise object that was introduced in ES 2015. These are not syntaxes. These are just features that your user's browser may or may not support. So of course, just like with PHP, the way that you guarantee that this exists is you include a polyfill. You include code that gives you the promise object if you don't have it natively in your browser. Now, the cool thing is that most polyfills are automatically added by Babel when you use them, which is awesome. So it'll actually read your code, suddenly see that you're using a promise somewhere, and then it'll go check and say, yep, they need to support IE11, and IE11 doesn't have a promise, and then it would include the promise into your final built files. If you didn't need it, then it wouldn't, or you never referenced a promise, then it wouldn't be in there. So your code will automatically get like a little bit bigger as you reference more features that require polyfills. And of course, I have this little star here. There's a couple edge things that aren't included. So if you are supporting IE11, you just take a quick look at this, bit.ly/missing from Babel polyfill. Just a couple of things that it doesn't polyfill that you would need to polyfill manually if you are using those features. So I mentioned CSS earlier, and so the idea behind Webpack is that you just write your code, and if you require another file, then you import it. It's gorgeous. You write good code. I need what that file gives me. Great, import it. So that other file becomes a dependency of your main file. So the way that Webpack wants you to think is it also wants you to take this same philosophy to CSS. So I want you to think of if you have a JavaScript file, and that JavaScript file, maybe renders some elements, and you want those elements to, and if you want those elements to look good, you need to include the CSS file on your page. Then Webpack would argue that that CSS file is a dependency of your file in the same way that other JavaScript files are a dependency of that main file. So the question is, could we do this? In the same way that we're importing store from /store, could we actually just import a CSS file? And the answer is totally. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you import your first line of CSS, what's going to happen is Encore is suddenly going to write an app.css. So the great thing about this is that you can have one file that imports another JavaScript file, that imports another JavaScript file, that imports another JavaScript file. And then that JavaScript file imports a CSS file. That little bit of CSS is going to ultimately go into app.css. So this is going to contain all the contents from all the CSS files that are imported by everything, by all the JavaScript that's in app.js. So it makes it really, really easy to kind of attach little bits of CSS to a JavaScript file because you just import it. Again, you code correctly, and then Webpack's going to package the whole thing together. So the reason, for this reason, in reality, in the same way that we're going to have Encore entry script tags, we're also going to have an Encore entry link tags, and it's going to output all of the link tags because sometimes it can be split into multiple pieces in the same way as the JavaScript. This will output all the link tags you need. And the nice thing is that if you don't reference any CSS, Webpack won't output an app.css, and this little helper function here won't render any link tags. So it's a safe thing to always have this, and then someday if you start importing some CSS, then it's going to automatically put itself there. So this is great. So another question though is, okay, what should my image paths look like? Because one of the classic problems of build systems is that when we have a CSS file, so let's pretend that we have a CSS file that has a background image. So historically, if you have a CSS file that goes through a build system, then you have to think, wait, I have the CSS file right here, but then it's going to be moved to this other directory when it's built. So do I need, when I set up my background image, do I need it to be, do I need to set it up as if it's kind of relative to its final location because it's going to be moved, or to its original location? And with less smart build systems like Gulp or something, the answer is usually you needed to put it as if the file, the relative to the final path. So you needed to think, where is this file going to eventually live? And then kind of go up 2 directories and then go into an images directory and then point to the background image. That is not the case at all with Webpack. Surprise, with Webpack, the way that you handle this is you code correctly. You just code, you just ignore the fact that there's a build system at all. So if I have a styles.css file, then I'm going to make this background image, this path here, be from the source file to the source file. So if this lives in a CSS directory, if the source file lives in a CSS directory, then this says, okay, go up 1 level, then go into images, and then go into logo.png. You don't have to worry at all about where it's going to live eventually. You just need to make these source paths work correctly. Again, it's just like PHP. If you're going to require something, you'd put the path to where the file lives right now. It's the same thing inside of here. So as soon as Webpack sees this, it's actually going to take this logo.png, it's going to move it into that build directory, and then it's going to rewrite this path here so that the final URL still works. So we code correctly, it takes care of packaging it all together. Oh, and this is like a little question I get from time to time. Or you can also import images from JavaScript. So this does the exact same thing. If I needed to reference a image in JavaScript for some reason, I can actually import it. Yeah, that's totally allowed. Import this PNG. What this is going to do is it's going to cause this sheep.png to get put into the build directory. And what it's going to return here is the string path to that file, the final built path to that file, so that we can just use it as the image source. And the cool thing is that that PNG, that sheep.png, will automatically have a versioned file name. And this path here will automatically have that version file name. So if you ever update that sheep.png, it's going to get a new version file name, and all your code is going to keep working instantly. So the point is, we need to stop thinking of our JavaScript as random code that executes and random code that we're hoping we put in the correct order or else it won't execute, and start thinking of it as a single application with the dependencies that are all packaged up together. We import JavaScript files, we import CSS files, we make sure all our paths are correct, and Webpack takes care of packaging everything up together. If we make even one tiny mistake, like including the background image, if we do this background image path incorrectly, Webpack won't even build. You're going to get a build error that says you messed up a path. So there's no way for you to make a mistake and not realize it until you actually get on production. So let's just kind of add a little feature to our application here. We're going to make an AJAX call. And to do this, we're going to use a library called Axios. It's probably the most popular JavaScript, sorry, of course, JavaScript, the most popular AJAX library out there. So we're going to do yarn add Axios. And that's going to download that into our node modules directory. Now, part of the reason I want to show this example is that one of the great things about like the whole new Webpack system here is you can actually download dependencies like this, yarn add Axios, and then you can actually just use them by saying import Axios from Axios. As soon as we do that, the Axios source code is going to go into our final built code. So it's very, very easy for us to bring third-party libraries into our code. And then we can just use it, axios.get, and then we can call .then, like you do with every AJAX library, and then go grab some data off of our response. So this is just going to work with one line at the command line. I have access to the Axios library, and I can import it instantly, and Webpack is packaging the whole thing together for me. Now, by the way, the Axios get call here, this returns a promise object. If you are not that familiar with promises, you probably use them all the time, even if you aren't that familiar with the name. Every asynchronous thing you do, every AJAX call you do, no matter what library you're using, what that AJAX call returns is a promise. So when you see the .then on something, that's actually a method on the promise object. So promise is the core concept in JavaScript for asynchronous things, and it is what allows us to leverage the .then and then pass it a callback to do something after that asynchronous thing. So this is probably what it's historically looked like when you've made AJAX calls, whether it's via Axios or jQuery or something different. So now let's mix it up a little bit. So one of the features, I think it was ES 2017, one of the newer features inside of JavaScript is the await syntax, and it's awesome. So the await syntax is the easy button on top of the promise system. So instead of having this kind of, axios.get and then we have a callback, what we can do instead is just say const response equals await axios.get. So when we do that, it's actually going to freeze on this line, wait until this finishes, and then, sorry, I'm going backwards again. And then whatever thing is normally passed to our callback, like when you use Axios, it passes you the response to the callback. Whatever is normally passed to your callback now becomes a return value. So the big advantage of this is that your code looks a bit more procedural and synchronous, and you can avoid the kind of callbacks. But in reality, this is still, of course, this is still making an async call here. So it's just a little bit more of a straightforward syntax on asynchronous code. Now, this is not going to work. So I'm talking about how great this is. This will totally give you an error. It will say, cannot use keyword await outside an async function, which when I first started using await, I was like, why, what, and why do I need to do that? Suddenly I need to wrap this code inside of an async function. So what we're going to do here is we actually are going to do that. I'll talk about why. I'm going to wrap this inside of a function. So I just put function start store app, and now I'm down here, I'm calling start store app. Now that this is in a function, I can put this little async thing on the end of it. Now, as soon as you mark a function as async, what it means is that your function now returns a promise. So what ultimately happens here is when we call start store app, the start store app call doesn't wait on this line. What it does is the start store app, when we execute it, this function finishes instantly. It does not wait for this. It finishes instantly, and it returns a promise object. And then the rest of our code down here, if I had other lines of code down here, they would just start running immediately. They would just keep going. They would not wait for this call here. But kind of behind the scenes, inside of this function, the code inside this function is still running, and it is waiting on this. So it's sort of like the code inside of our start store app becomes sort of synchronous feeling. It calls this and does await, but the rest of our application keeps going. So you kind of need to wrap it inside of a function so you can isolate the part that you want to behave sort of synchronously, so that the rest of your application can just keep going. So I do use await and async all the time because I love the simpler syntax, and this is kind of the key to get it to work, and the reason why you need that async function. So right now we've been keeping things very simple, and it means that as we add more code to our application, as we install more modules into our application and start using them, our one app.js file is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And okay, sure, Webpack is actually splitting app.js into this vendors app.js. But the point is those two files are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as we add more code to it. So how can we fix that? Because maybe some code we're adding is only needed on the checkout page. It's not actually needed on every page, but the problem is we're importing it from app.js, so that checkout logic is going to go into the final app.js, which means that our users are going to download it on every single page, even if they don't need it. So there's three options when it comes to kind of organizing your app to split, to kind of make your code smaller. And the first one is to not worry about it. And this is the simplest option. Simplest option is just to keep coding. Everything goes into app.js. The app.js is almost like the controller for your application. It would kind of instantiate all the functionality it needs. It's dead simple. you can use any of your JavaScript on any page, and life is good. And of course, the downside is that app.js file gets big. The second option is something called page-specific entries. I'll talk about this in a second. And the third one, which is one that I'm liking more and more and more, and in reality, I combine these two, is called async code splitting. So first, the page-specific entries. So the idea is that we have like a store page or a store section, and it has a bunch of JavaScript and CSS related to just that section of our site. So we don't want all that code to go into our app.js and app.css files, which are loaded on every page. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a second entry called store and point it at a new store.js file. So the app.js here is going to be sort of our global or layout JavaScript. We're going to include this in our base layout. So it's going to be any JavaScript or CSS that we need to run on every page, or maybe that powers our nav bar or our footer or sidebar or something like that. And then the store.js, that's going to be page specific or maybe section specific JavaScript. So we're only going to include that on our store template or a store section. So there's base.html twig for the app, and then some other store/index.html twig is including the script tags for store. So by moving a bunch of JavaScript specific to store from our app.js into store.js, this gets smaller, but now we need to have this on a different page. But that's good because it means all the JavaScript inside this store.js is only going to be included once the user goes to that page. So this is the most traditional way to split things up into pieces, basically page-specific entries or page-specific JavaScript. So the other way that I like to use in tandem with this, because there are pros and cons to this approach that we'll talk about, is to use something called an async import. So this is what our code looks like right now. I haven't changed anything yet. We are importing store, and then we have our start store app, and it instantiates a store object. Great, awesome, love it. So if you look closely though, this store import is really only needed if the current page has a store element. Because the whole point of this system here is that, okay, we find this store L, and then we inside start store app, we kind of pass that store L to the store object, and it adds some functionality to it. So in reality, if this were a real app, I'd probably have this entire section here wrapped in an if statement. I would say, okay, I only need to run any of this code if the store L is actually found on the page. The problem is, though, is that Webpack is this static generator. It doesn't know what page you're on. You just run it one time. It follows all of your imports, and it puts all of those into your app, your final built file. So store.js is going to be in that final built file all the time, even though we're not going to need it on a lot of pages. So wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Wouldn't it be cool if we could have that if statement that says, if we have a store element on the page, now I want to import store from /component/store and use it down here. That'd be so awesome, because then we could keep all this store code out of our built file, but then get it later when we need it. Wouldn't this be cool? This doesn't work, sorry, but it almost works. So there is a feature that does this, but we need to change the syntax of our import a little bit. Normally, import is not a function. Notice import is not a JavaScript function. It's a JavaScript keyword. It has a special function inside of JavaScript, but you can use it in Webpack as a function. So this is the exact same code, but I've changed the import here to be import open parentheses, and then the path to the JavaScript module that I want to load. And what this is actually going to do is it's going to be an AJAX call. So if there's a store element on the page, then Webpack is going to make an AJAX call for this one element. And of course, what do all AJAX calls return? They return promises. So I'm going to chain a .then off of this and then run this code after that AJAX call has been finished. So this is gorgeous because it says, okay, go make an AJAX call for that module. When it finishes, pass me that module, and then I will use it like normal. Now, as soon as you change from using the traditional import on the top of your file to this import function, what it means is that the store.js code is going to be removed from the built file. So our initial page load will be faster because it's no longer inside of the app.js file. And then, because we're using import as a function, Webpack realizes that it's going to need to be able to access and download that single module. So it actually takes this store.js code and outputs a new 0.js file or 1.js or 2.js. It figures out this index system internally. But the point is it takes that code and isolates it. So in this case, when we actually hit this line of code here, that's going to asynchronously go and download 0.js, which it split itself. So the downside of this is obviously that you have an asynchronous call. So if you use this in a situation where, like, when I click this button, I need this thing to happen, that actually might be a really great spot to use this this feature, because maybe that button is not a very commonly clicked button. And so, and the JavaScript that is executed when you click it is really big. So by using an async import, on button click, then go get this module, it means that your final output, your normal output app.js file can be much smaller. And then only on click, only when the user actually needs the JavaScript would it go get it. But of course, because it's asynchronous, then you got to start thinking about, do I need a loading animation? Like when I click, we add a little loading animation right here, and then we, take the loading animation off once the module is actually executed and our callback is being called. So it adds that little bit of extra complexity. In this case, this might be a perfect example of a perfect use case of it. It's because, when our page originally loads, it looks for a specific store element, and then it goes and makes an AJAX call if that element is there. So this would mean that whatever this store element does, its functionality would be slightly delayed while that AJAX call finishes, but it's probably nothing that the user would notice unless the purpose of this store module is to actually write a bunch of HTML. But if it's just to attach a few event listeners, then unless your user is really fast at clicking while the page is still loading, they might not notice it, or they probably won't notice it. So I'm almost wrapped up, I promise. There's basically kind of two big things two really cool things I want to talk about still. The first thing I want to address is client-side versus server-side rendering. So the trend has definitely been towards client-side rendering. So we're talking about Vue, React, Next.js, Gatsby, fill in the blank. Those front-end frameworks that actually write the HTML on the client side. Now, I'm old enough now that I've seen lots of technologies come and been like, this is going to be the thing that everybody uses. And then eventually that's not what happens. And it just becomes a new option that some people use. And I knew there would at some point be kind of a pushback. I knew that the entire internet wasn't going to eventually be client-side generated because most websites don't need that. They just need kind of like the traditional server-side generated HTML, and then they need that HTML to have JavaScript behavior added to it. But other applications absolutely need that. Or you might have a traditional application that outputs HTML, but you might just use something like Vue or React on one page or one section or for one widget. So the trend has definitely been towards client-side rendering, and I think for the first time over the past few months, we've seen the kind of the first organized pushback that says, no, this is not something that every application needs. So some examples, like who renders, like what are some cool sites that we use that render things server-side? There are many, many of them, but GitHub renders things server-side. Hey.com, which is the new trendy email service. So that's an email app that does not use a front-end framework. So you would think that, hey, if you were going to create a brand new fancy email app in 2020, that would certainly need to be written in a front-end framework. And no, it's not. Hey.com is a Ruby on Rails app that generates HTML on the server side, and then they just add some basic JavaScript on the client side. And then Stack Overflow is another one. And what I really want you to kind of realize about these three sites, these three examples here, is if you look at their AJAX calls, not all of them, but many of them, I think most of them, certainly most of them for GitHub, and I think Hey.com, if you look at what happens when they make an AJAX call, their AJAX calls return HTML. That's the thing that we've been told is ugly and should be killed for the past 10 or 15 years. But they're doing it. And this is that pushback I'm talking about. You would expect at this point that all API endpoints should be returning JSON, right? And then you take that JSON and you write JavaScript that parses that JSON and builds the HTML. And that is definitely not wrong. It's just there are different use cases. And I want you to recognize that there are many, many people that are returning HTML from the server side and then adding JavaScript to that HTML that's coming from the server side. So yeah, GitHub has a beautiful API. Their front end doesn't use it. Their back end might, but their front end is not making direct API calls to their API and then getting back JSON and building HTML. They're making AJAX calls to their server, and their server is doing whatever and then returning HTML. So of course, the point is do what makes sense for your app. But there's not, don't feel embarrassed if you're building a traditional web app that's returning HTML from AJAX calls, because you're doing the same thing as probably the websites that you use most throughout the day. So the last thing I want to talk about, which is going to seem, if you haven't seen this before, a little bit random, but I love this, and I've been talking about it with everybody I can. It's a library called Stimulus.js, and I think it's just the perfect companion for, hold on, I'm gonna change this here because I confused somebody when I was going through this in a workshop the other day. There we go. This is a perfect companion for situations where your server is rendering the HTML. So like those traditional spots where you render HTML, twig template, and you have that. This is built by the Basecamp people, same people that did Hey.com, the people that are behind or originally behind Ruby on Rails. So this is actually a library. It's not new at all. It's been around forever. Ruby on Rails people have been using this for years and years and years. I only recently discovered it, and I think that it is awesome. So we're going to install Stimulus. I just want to give you guys a quick preview of what it does. So I'm going to say yarn add Stimulus. Great. It's in our application. And then we're going to write some one-time setup code. Don't stare at this code too closely. This is copy and pasted from their docs. These are the 5 lines of code that you need to have to get your Stimulus application running, and I'll talk about what it does in a second. The most important thing here is that this line here is basically going to automatically import every file that we put into a controller's directory. So if we put something in the controller's directory, it's going to kind of automatically be seen and understood by Stimulus, and we'll see what that means in a second. So here's the idea behind Stimulus. Let's say we have an element on our page and it's rendered on our server in Twig, whatever, and we want to add some JavaScript functionality to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a data-controller attribute to it and give that a name like store. Cool. Then we're going to create inside of our controllers directory that Stimulus we just pointed at a second ago, we're going to create a store_controller.js file. So Stimulus has a little bit of conventions built into it. You don't have to use them, but by convention, this data controller store is going to match up with this store_controller.js. So that's how these two things are linked. Now, the real power behind Stimulus is that when your page loads and this JavaScript is executed, Stimulus is going to automatically instantiate one instance of this object here per element on the page that has data controller store. Now, this is really important for 2 reasons. The first reason is that when it does that, it makes the element that it's attached to available on a this.element property. So it's a really, really easy way to start kind of creating classes that operate on an element. And then when Stimulus instantiates your controller object down here, it calls an initialize function. So this is just an example here that if I had one of these on the page, then I'd have one object. My initialize call would be called one time, and it would log this message, and I could see that this.element is referring to this element. If I had 3 of these on my page, because maybe this is actually a data controller comment, and I have a commenting system, if I have 3 of these on the page, then I'm going to have 3 objects. So you get this nice scoped object, like this one object is scoped to this one element, and now we can start adding behavior to it. And the most important part about this is that it's going to instantiate one object per element no matter when or how this element is added. So if our page originally loaded with just one data controller equals store on it, but then later we made an AJAX call that returned HTML, let's say, and we put that HTML into our page, and part of that HTML had data controller equals store on it, at that moment, Stimulus would instantiate a second element or a second object. This solves the problem of the classic kind of traditional JavaScript problem of, well, when my page loaded, I wrote all my JavaScript that added all the event listeners, but darn it, once I made an AJAX call and changed something on the page, it stopped working because that added new elements to my page and I didn't have my event listeners attached to it. So this solves that because you're going to instantly get a new instance of your object and you can attach the behavior to it. So that is like, I'm going to show you a couple other features. Stimulus is a really small library, but that is Stimulus's superpower. This automatic binding or instantiation of a single object to a single DOM element, no matter when or how that element is added. Like that right there solves pretty much all of my JavaScript problems on the client side when I'm doing the kind of traditional application. Now, you can, like I said, I'm going to show two other features in this tiny library in a second, but you can stop here. You can use no other features at all. You could just say, okay, I know that every time this is instantiated, it's going to call the initialize function. So inside the initialize function, I'm going to take the code that we already have, that store object, and I'm just going to instantiate a store object and pass it this.element, which is the element that this is attached to. Just by doing this, I can now dynamically add new data-controller equals store elements to the page via AJAX. And every time that I do that, I'm going to get a new instance of this object, initialize is going to be called, and I'm going to instantiate a new store object. So as soon as I just add a new element to the page with that data-controller, boom, it's going to have all of the JavaScript functionality automatically attached to it without me needing to think and worry about manually instantiating my code on it. Or you can choose, if you want to use some of its features. So Stimulus basically has two features. The first one is it has the ability to attach listeners, which is really nice. It has kind of a funny syntax, but you pass data action equals, and then you say the name of the event you want, like click or mouse over. This is the name of the controller, and this is the name of the method you want on that object. So then every time we click that, print products is going to be called. And I can't remember if I said it here. And again, like one of the really nice things about this is that if somehow via JavaScript, AJAX, whatever, a second button with this same data action is added to this element later, it's going to automatically work. So you don't need to think about re-registering your event listeners on new elements. It's just going to work. The other feature that it has is the idea to find elements. So in this case, what you can do is you can say data-target equals store.product.list. I just made that up. And as soon as you do that, down here, you magically can say this.product.list.target, and that's going to equal this element right there. So, you know, a lot of times you'll do things where you are like, okay, I need to, now that this thing has been clicked, I need to like find this other element so I can update its HTML. Targets are just a cleaner way to do that because you can define these targets and then you can reference them right here and have them do their thing. So the event listeners and the targets are really the only two features, and you don't even have to use those. I just think that the first part of Stimulus is just absolutely brilliant. And one last kind of example I wanted to show here is, this is, for me, like a really, really fantastic way to start wrapping your legacy jQuery, whatever code, into a more sane structure. So let me actually show the code here. Yeah, let's show the code. So let's pretend like I have a comments area here. And very simply, what we're going to do is let's say this is already a feature we have on our site today. And the way the feature works is if you click this button here, then it capitalizes the comment. And you can see I have a couple of classes on here that my JavaScript is going to use to find this stuff. So I'm going to use this JS button make louder class to find that element and attach the listener. And then I'll use this class over here to find that element and uppercase this stuff. So this is what my legacy jQuery looks like. I find my comment text element here, and then I find my button on click. Then I change the HTML and I change it to the uppercase version. Great. So let's say you just have this code written somewhere around in your application. What you can do with stimulus is you can move this into stimulus. So far what I've done is almost just copy and pasted that into the initialize function of a stimulus controller. The only difference I did after I pasted it in is that instead of just $, open parentheses, JS comment text, there should be a dash there. What I'm going to do is $, open parentheses, this dot element dot find, and then that thing. So by making this little change here, whenever you find something, it makes the behavior of this no longer global. Because before, this was actually finding every single JS comment text on the page. And this is finding every single JS button make louder on the page. But now it's scoping, this down here, it's actually scoping it to just the element that this controller is attached to. And again, if you had 5 of these data dash controllers on your page, you would have 5 different objects that all would attach their own listeners to their own scoped element. So it's just by doing this, we've kind of changed our jQuery code from acting globally to acting locally. And the benefit of this is that just by doing this, if we add new elements to our page with that data controller comment thing, then we're instantly going to get a new instance of this object, and it's instantly going to attach that behavior. So this is like a very simple thing you can do to make your JavaScript able to work on new elements, not just the elements that existed on the page when you ran that code. Now, the last thing I want to mention here, if you do this, is I'm going to make one other little change down here related to how I attach the click listener to this button. And the change is going to be this. And maybe you've seen this before. It's called a delegate selector. By the way, this is something you don't need to worry about if you use Stimulus's like event listener actions feature, because it just takes care of this automatically. But if you are interested in kind of just taking your legacy code and at least moving it into a stimulus controller type of thing, then this is what I'd recommend. One other change I'd recommend. And the idea is that instead of finding the button and then registering it on click, you're actually going to register the click on the root element. And with jQuery, there's also a yarn library called delegate, which you can use if you're not using jQuery. But with jQuery, you can actually do this. You can say on click of the element, and here you pass it the actual element that you wanted this listener to be truly attached to. So the end result of this is exactly the same, except that if later, somehow via AJAX call, JavaScript, whatever, if somehow a new button is added to the page that has JS button louder, this new code is going to work for it instantly. Whereas this code up here, that would only find the one button that's on the page right now. So if we added another JS button louder later, it wouldn't have an event listener attached to it. So the delegate selector solves that, and then you truly have this robust stimulus controller that's going to work no matter when and how future HTML is added in that element, or if new data controller elements are added. So that is it right there. My kind of putting it all together here is that when you hear ES6, ES 2015, 16, 17, these are the new versions of JavaScript that are not supported by all browsers. Webpack is the actual tool that's main job is to follow those imports and put everything into one package. And Encore is just a Webpack config generator. I love it, but it's really not that impressive. It's meant to be small. And Babel is actually the reason that you can use new JavaScript today, even though it's not supported in your browsers. Babel is also the tool that makes Vue and React work. Both Vue and React use non-JavaScript syntaxes. React uses JSX, and Vue uses single file components. So you don't need Webpack and Babel technically to use React and Vue, but effectively you do. And the reason is that they both use syntaxes that aren't real JavaScript. So they rely on Babel to read that not real JavaScript and write it into real JavaScript. So that's why you always have a build system with front-end frameworks. And of course, React.js, Vue, Next.js, these are all the nifty frameworks for generating HTML client side. And as I mentioned, my big message there is use these when appropriate, don't use them when not appropriate. And they're not just for single page applications. We use them all the time on our site just to power a section or a widget, and they are awesome and I love them. I especially like Vue. And Stimulus is like just a wonderful tool for working with that server generated HTML and adding behavior to it. And with that, I will stop talking. Thank you guys all for coming into my guest bedroom here with our elephant. If you want to go through this at a slightly less belligerent pace, you can check out our JavaScript track on SymfonyCast. And thank you very much for having me.
Wow, thank you so much, Ryan. It really was a history of just JavaScript since I stopped using it about 15 years
Yeah, exactly,
ago.
right?
Having to look out now. I mean, we've got some questions. I've got a whole page of notes here and stuff, but I doubt I'll go through everything I've got here. Let's ask questions from the floor. And the first one that came in, which should be quite easy to answer, I think, is says, so Encore translates my code to ES5 automatically. Is that true?
Automatically. Yep, it is automatic. It automatically includes Babel, and it automatically includes the one Babel preset it automatically includes is the preset env, which is the one that does that transformation.
Okay, great. Okay, so next we have, assuming the app.js is minimized and compressed, does imported JS code by the async import mechanism, will that also be minimized and compressed too?
Excellent question. Answer is yes. And it's because when you run yarn Encore production, that sends a flag into Encore to do production mode, and everything is minimized. Whether it's that main app.js, it'll also minimize those 0.js, and it will minimize the CSS as well.
Okay, great. Okay, so are there any plans to make totally separate SPA projects, e.g. for Vue or React, Angular, etc., that are consuming or using Symfony applications as an API?
Can you read that again? Make sure I understood that correctly.
So is there any plan to make totally separate SPA projects, e.g. for Vue, React, Angular, etc., that are consuming Symfony applications as an API?
There's no plans, and I don't know if that question is kind of about like, are somebody going to build some, is there a plan, are there specific kind of like random projects that people are thinking about building, or open source projects? I don't know if it's a question about that, or if it's a question more about, is there a plan to kind of make like a skeleton where it's like, here's your skeleton that's a Symfony project and a Vue app, and it's all kind of like pre-wired together and set up. I mean, actually, we talked about that. That is one thing that I think is missing at the very least in the Encore documentation. Is it's super easy to tell Encore to understand and parse React files or understand and parse Vue files, but we don't then actually give you even in the documentation code of what a hello world Vue app would look like, which seems not important, but it actually, I actually, after we talked about it, had to find a Vue app, a simple Vue app, so I could copy and paste it for some reason, and it was actually kind of hard to find. One of the tricky things is that if you're in the React world, they want you to use React Create app, which is a generator that generates an entire project. And if you're building a single page application, you probably should use that. Even if it's talking to like a Symfony backend. But if you just need it for like a section of your site, then you don't really need that. You probably just want to open a file and write a few lines of React code and go. But because React and Vue have their own generation tools, sometimes it's kind of hard to find those like hello world type of things. So I don't know if I answered that question or not. The one other thing I'll mention is that we do, in our Vue tutorial, we have a Vue tutorial that we just finished releasing, and we'll make like one or two other ones pretty soon on SymfonyCasts. That is a Vue front end that's talking to an API platform backend. So if you want to use that, check that out as an example, you can.
Cool. So there's a question here. Is there support for fancy CSS loaders like Sass to Tailwind to purge CSS to CSS Nano?
I can say maybe, and I think the answer is yes, but I'm not familiar with how the order that all those tools are in there. So Sass is a pre-processor, but we just have a method for that called enable Sass loader, and you call that, and boom, you can just have files that end in .scss, and it works. We also have another method for .enable post CSS loader, which is the library that applies all post CSS transformations. For example, the most famous one is probably auto prefixer. And so some of those things you listed, I don't know if they're supposed to be on the pre-process or the post process. I'm guessing at least some of them, if not all of them, are post process. So you do a SAS, you do enable SAS loader for the pre-processing, and then you do enable post CSS loader. And then all you would need to have after that is you just need to make your post css.config.js file. So yeah, Symfony sets up post CSS for you, or Webpack Encore sets up post CSS for you so that you can just create the configuration file that says, okay, run it through this and then this and then this. So my answer to that is I'm pretty sure, but I can't say for sure.
Okay, cool. And there's a comment here as well that says, I just want to say I really love Tobias and Ryan for their enthusiasm, sense of humor, easy to follow and still high quality educational information, and the real asset for the dev community. Amazing work.
Thank you very much.
That's a lovely. It's all jumping around in front of me now. I can't see what's if there's any new questions or it's been upvoted. I think it's been upvoted. But I did want to ask actually, and I noticed a comment on an old PR, on an old GitHub issue about this, and I didn't have time to chase it through and figure out the actual answer. Is there support for hot reloading if you're running through?
Such a good question. Yeah. There is support for hot module reloading. Yes, the answer is yes. And actually we show it in our view tutorial. I think we need to do a little more. So first of all, hot module reloading is awesome. That's where your page just refreshes, or updates without refreshing. So I just go over to my editor, and then when I flip over, it's just there. And hot module reloading doesn't work for all JavaScript. You have to be kind of inside of a library that supports it. So if you're using Vue or React, those are libraries that do support hot module reloading. And so hot module reloading works automatically with Encore if you're using Vue. And I can't remember with React because I haven't tried it in a while. What you do there is you run, instead of yarn dev, you run yarn, instead of yarn dev, you run yarn dev -server. And there are different things that happen behind the scenes to make this all work. But basically it should work out of the box. That starts a little web server that serves your files. Encore automatically exposes the domain that it's on to your Symfony application. So all of your script and link tags instantly update to point to it. So the dev server just works seamlessly. The one thing that doesn't work out of the box with the HMR, hot module replacement, is CSS. And CSS is supposed to. It's because of a design decision that we made inside of Encore. So if you look at Webpack normally, I'll try to keep this under 30 seconds. But if you read Webpack tutorials, what they originally do when you require or import a CSS file is they actually have Webpack set up so that CSS goes into the JavaScript file. There's no actual CSS file that's output. And then when you load the page, the JavaScript is downloaded and it adds the CSS. There's actually JavaScript inside of there that takes the CSS that's embedded inside of it and outputs it onto the page, puts it inside the head tag. This is a development only setting because when you do this, your whole page kind of blinks for a second before the styles are added. But it's done that way because it's just really, really easy. And then on production, you're supposed to change the settings to actually output a real CSS file and then add the link tag. So when we originally made Encore, we chose not to do that because we wanted the dev and production environments to be the same. We didn't want people to not have a link tag in dev and then go to production and be like, where are my styles? So we always output the CSS file, but HMR doesn't work with the output CSS file right now, or at least not without hacks. It only works with that inline mode. So if you want to use it, there's a method on Encore. I can't remember what it's called right now, but it's something like Encore.disable CSS extraction, I think. And if you call that, that basically puts it back to the mode that does support HMR. So you can even do it like an if statement that says like, if we're in development mode, Encore development build, then do that disable thing and then HMR is going to work. So the long answer to the answer is yes, but you have to be using a front-end framework. If you want CSS, you have to disable the HMR thing or disable the CSS extraction.
Okay.
And it's really cool when you get it working.
Yeah. So I've been playing about with some React recently, and I kind of miss the hot reloading.
Yeah, it's there. You just got to turn it on. The other reason we don't like really push for it is because it launches a new web server, and then sometimes people are like have HTTPS certificate problems because they have some weird setup or their ports blocked. So it adds complexity to the setup that is going to cause problems in like 10% of the cases. So that's why it's like a second-class citizen inside of Encore's documentation.
Yeah. Okay. So another question's just come through. Again, I think this would be a fairly easy one for you to answer. Do you think new improvements have updated JS for the current era?
Sorry, say that again.
Do you think new improvements have updated JS for the current era?
Just kind of like, do I think that these changes are kind of for the better of JavaScript?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. The downside is we're, of course, like anything, we're adding complexity, right? You know, and so like with anything, opt into what you actually need. I think the only things that you truly need in modern JavaScript is you need the ability to import modules so that you're not writing, you know, trying to keep things in order. And man, like that's the most important thing. So you could say, look, I'm not going to use post CSS. I'm not going to use Sass. I'm not going to use a front-end framework. You say, I'm just going to use Encore, and it's going to help me write my just normal, boring kind of jQuery, tried and true, man. I'm not knocking jQuery. My good, boring jQuery in a better way, you know, where I can actually like kind of share, put a function that does something into a module, and then import it, and then leave everything off. You know, just not use anything else. Even for me, and I look at a lot of JavaScript, like one of the difficult things is that when you really get into people that really are JavaScript developers, they're using so many like new syntaxes that like sometimes I find their code hard to read. TypeScript, I don't know TypeScript yet. So TypeScript, when I see TypeScript, that's more and more popular. It's hard to read. If you're really into JavaScript and you're really into type-safe JavaScript, use TypeScript. But for the rest of us, yeah, we can just use a couple features if you want, and then leave the rest of it until later or never.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I think we'd probably better. I think people will probably want to try and get to bed quite soon, so we'd better cut it there, I guess. Thank you so much, Ryan. That's been absolutely amazing. Like, I think for me, the two biggest takeaways here have been, first of all, you've cleared up modules for me. Like I kind of understand. I've been using them, but now I understand them a lot more. And it's also another thing that I noticed was it's interesting how you can. You said that CSS can be included multiple levels deep in JS.
Mm-hmm.
And when I've been using Webpack Encore, I've been kind of linking all of my CSS in my top, importing from my top level styles, SCSS or whatever. But I think that certainly is going to change what I do, because I think I'm going to be able to make stuff a lot more modular now.
Awesome, yeah, and you will have some of that, right? But it doesn't need to be everything, you know. So your layout stuff up here, but not everything.